you, everyone. I lied about starting at the 3-minute mark. We're trying to get our moderator in. We're having some Zoom technical difficulties here. Should be having Carl, our CEO, joining here in a second. But while we wait, it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and do intros to kick this thing off. So first of all, Clayton, Kast, Director of Accounts here at Draft.dev. I'm our host today for our monthly webinar series here at Draft.dev, covering all things DevRel and dev marketing related. Today, we're really going to be focusing on building a vibrant dev community. So more specifically, defining and understanding developer communities, growth strategies, resource allocation, internal versus external community drive, and the community impact on business outcomes. The people that are joining us today is Rebecca. She is head of community over at Common Room, and then Ron is head of dev relations at Appsmith, and then Tessa is DevRel leader and coach, who's currently consulting for a few organizations and cut her teeth as some of your favorite names in the space. Really happy to have everyone join today. And I think I'm just going to take on the moderator role today since Carl's having issues. Normally we'd be joined by our CEO, Carl Hughes, but Zoom is giving him a headache today, so I'm going to be running the show for everyone. With that, guys, let's just dive into it. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, awesome. So let me bring up Carl's speaker guide here, and we'll get into these questions. So first of all, we'll just sort of do a round robin, and then based off how you guys answer, we'll just go into the intricacies of each of your responses. We don't really have to go in order. If someone else fills it for you, we definitely don't need to expand any further. But to kick things off, let's just talk about the various types of developer communities you guys commonly see, whether it's like internal for customers, external, such as Reddit, open source like GitHub. What are the other types of dev communities you're seeing around the space maybe, and what are your favorites between those few? Just for fun, since you're first on my screen, Rebecca, maybe I'll send that your way.
Yeah, thanks for letting me kick it off. I actually really love how I think different people talk about various types of developer communities differently. And so the way that you had even teed this up, I think is super interesting. You talk about internal for customers, but I think we also see internal communities like internal community managers or developer community managers within a business itself, trying to enable developer advocates within a business or other developers. Like, how do we actually take that developer experience and apply it to what's happening within our own business? And so I have seen various internal community managers or developer community managers also within a business to enable developers within that business to succeed in the same way that you want to enable external developers to succeed with your product. So I wanted to make that distinction in terms of internal. I wouldn't say it's something that we see super popularized, but people who do it well, I think is there's a lot to be learned from how empowering your internal developer teams can also teach you about how you can empower your external developer community members. So that's one distinction I wanted to kind of call out there in terms of the way you teed that up, because I think it's I've seen it happen at a few different community leaders and customers, and I think it's a really valuable way to approach thinking about what it means to be a holistic to empower community holistically, both in your own internal business and then how that reverberates externally. I like how you talk about the example you gave, Reddit as an external community. Because, and this might be like a point of debate or, like healthy discourse. Whereas I think you could say like Reddit and Stack Overflow, right? These more public open forums, they're certainly a type of community, but I might also more define it as an audience, right? And so those are audiences of people who are interested in an industry space or a product space, but they're not necessary. There are certainly some like really large, like, slash AWS developers is a pretty big community on Reddit, for example. But I think a lot of times seeing Reddit overall as a community is not necessarily the way we would view it at Common Room. We'd see it more as like a space for for community leaders and developer community leaders to understand what people in that space are eager to learn about or need more resources about, or the types of like field or industry questions that are really top of mind for people.
And so it's usually more as a resource, and you also just have a lot more or a lot less control in that space too. Reddit is sort of the Wild West. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely more of like interacting with an audience in a public forum and then understanding what that discourse is around it. And so before I like springboard into all sorts of other things, since I talked about two of those distinctions that I thought stood out to me in terms of like internal developer communities, like internally based businesses, or empowering your internal developers. The more I say that, the weirder it sounds. So I'm just going to stop there. Or like audiences on Reddit and what that means to be an audience versus a community. I want to open it up to other folks before I'm like, let me tell you what else we think about community.
Yeah, it's great to get your agency perspective, but also Tessa and Ron, you guys more so come from like doing it for your actual organization. Curious to see how that maybe you agree or differ on those takes.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in quick on the Reddit side, I see Reddit as a channel. So when I'm going through and sort of building out my developer programs, Reddit is a channel because it is external. And yes, like, you know, to what Rebecca said, you can have your own sort of like subreddit and you can curate that in some ways. But for me, it's more of like where you're going to see the developers and hopefully where you can either learn from them or start to like engage with them. And then they eventually come into your hosted community is sort of like how I see Reddit as like insights and then, you know, sort of that kind of maybe attribution channel.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing, Tessa. The way that we kind of look at it is there's all these different channels and we want to try and get our information out to where our users are the way they want to consume it. One of my goals, and, you know, we're building this community portal at Appsmith, is that we're trying as much as possible to use those channels to try and help pull people into those places where we can have deeper conversations. Like somebody comes in on Reddit and they want to hang out there and they want to stay there. I think to your point, Rebecca, sometimes that is an audience, but as we want to help find the people that we can help the most with our tools and products, we want to help bring them further down in the funnel and expose them to more things. That becomes super important. One other thing you said, Rebecca, which I thought was really cool, was that idea of community. And it is, the way that I view it is it's very big. Like coming from a very strong open source background, like my default position is if you've ever seen or touched or heard of our product, then you're in our community, right? Like you may be very far on the fringes, but you're there. But we were talking about how like last week I traveled to go do this on site for our company. And at one point I stood up in front of everyone and said that. I was like, just a reminder, everyone in this room that works at Appsmith, you're part of our community too. So like, I want you to be sharing what you like and don't like. And I want you to have an outlet for the things you're trying to do and taking part in those conversations, you know. It's not like you're hiding away and doing the thing and someone else is enjoying it. Like you're part of this whole thing too. And we need all of those voices. So I thought that was really cool to how you kind of broke that out.
So just again, welcome to the party, Carl. Good to have you join.
Apologies for my technical difficulties today.
I decided I didn't need you already. I'm rolling with this. We're
okay. Continue without me.
Okay, so I feel like interesting the same vein as we're making the distinctions between the more organic flows like Reddit versus like structured communities. How do you see like the cultivation of those two? Like what are the differences? How are you approaching the strategy of those two? Well, how do you guys sort of like to dive into those and prioritizing one over the other maybe?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah, right. Sorry.
Very loaded questions. No, I mean, I think that's good. Like, you know, when you start to think about, I guess, prioritizing those communities as you, let me take a step back. So when I dive into developer programs, I draft out a developer journey map. And this is like there's a coined version that is in hold on, this book is on my desk somewhere, I think. It is in the book that is titled How to Build and Grow Successful Developer Programs. And it's by Caroline Luco and James Pardon. Really great book. And they have a GitHub repo that has some resources on it. And one of those resources is a developer journey map. When I saw that concept, I was like, oh my gosh, someone created a framework for how I think about DevRel, and this is beautiful. So when you think about that journey map, I'll kind of just explain it really briefly, is there's different stages that a developer is going to be in, right? So they first come to you and they're in discover, then they're kind of working through evaluating, are you their platform, right? Then they're going to learn how to use it, then they're going to start building, and then they're going to kind of launch and do all their stuff. And so that's sort of how the map goes. And so as I think about communities, there are various communities that play different roles in that map, right? And so when we think about the discover stage, just like we talked about, that's where Reddit can sort of live in there. That's where other social platforms live in. We might see sort of, very niche communities in there. So if you're like in DevOps, is there like a DevOps community? DevOps days in their kind of circuit. And that's starting to sort of get into events, right? But there's still a community. And so you see a lot of communities that exist in sort of that discover stage. But then as you continue working on, you're still going to sort of see all these other communities, right? And so when they get into evaluate or learn, or really even when they're in some of those latter stages, they should be hanging out in your community, right? And Ron spoke to that too, of like, hey, let's bring people from Discord, or not from Discord, sorry, Reddit. Discord, that's a whole nother community, right? But bringing people from Reddit into sort of your funnel and what you're working in. And that falls into some of those latter areas. And so I think when I think about community, I really think about it like very much the way Ron said about like, it's everyone who's there. If you know about our product and you even are in the laterals, whether you're a lurker, a past user, have never touched us, but like you're just a part of that entire community. And so each of those different stages are going to deliver you the different types of community that you need at the different times, right? So when you're building, let's send you over to GitHub. Let's get you in those code samples. Let's get you in some of these developer playgrounds. And it's all sort of like when and where and how you bring in those different communities. That's at least how I look at it.
Yeah, I think we've at Common Room, we've tried to put, I don't want to say that we coined these terms, but for us, we've tried to put some vocabulary or lexicon around it. So I'll share some of that here in case it's like also a lexicon that helps other folks. But the way that we think about it, right, is like there's your, what Ron said, anyone who's like talked about your product or thought about using your product, or honestly, we might even expand that out to like anyone who's in your industry who would get value out of using your product, you could see as like a potential community member or someone who would potentially find value in your community, in your product community. So we look at it as like tertiary channels, which would start at like the Reddits and Stack Overflows, the super public types of forums, but people are talking about your industry or your field or the solution that your product is solving, even if it's not directly related to how your product solves it, but they're like in the market for like solutions around that. They're interested in like, better ETL. And they're like, okay, great. That's like good to know. Like this is where you are in this tertiary community. And then when you're able, what we would say at Common Room is you're able to do something like use tools to do ecosystem listening, right? So now you're listening around what's going on in the ecosystem, people who are in that ecosystem in that tertiary channel that would be interested in what you do. And then you can start to like, by offering value in some of those Reddit threads or some of those subreddits, like truly offering value and not just like selling your product. Then whenever I answer on Reddit, I say, full disclosure, I work at Common Room and this is how we think of it. So if people get value from it and they want to follow Common Room, great. If they don't get value from it, they know that it's not like a weird surreptitious me trying to like do some backdoor selling or something. But then as you start to offer value on those threads, and then people say, oh, okay, I was kind of interested in what this person from Common Room had said. And then some of them move into that secondary. So there's tertiary and then secondary community sphere, which would be like maybe following you or like visiting your GitHub, right? Or like checking our GitHub discussions, following you on Twitter, following you on LinkedIn. So then that's kind of that secondary community where you're not owning it, but these are people who have chosen to learn a little bit more about specifically your product or your brand. And then ultimately, if you continue offering value through that like secondary sphere, then the goal, right, is that people are like, now I really want to know what Appsmith is doing. I really want to know how Common Room is thinking about this. And then you can like offer them value and say, hey, there's a special program that we're running through our community, our let's say primary community owned community channels, which might be your Slack or your Discord, where then those people are super close to what your product is doing and to what the solution that you're offering through your product. And so we look at it in terms of like tertiary, secondary, and primary community levels, if you will. And the more that the more people that are opting into that like close primary community level, the more that they've bought in and the more value that you can create with them, and also the more value you need to deliver for them. So it's like a with great power comes great responsibility type of deal. But it's certainly like that's the sort of like lexicon we've tried to use in terms of talking about external, very public channels to like a little bit more owned to like owned communities that you're really trying to co-create and co-generate value with and from.
You know, that's interesting, Rebecca, because one of the things we try and do over here is think about when we're creating content or conversations or events or, you know, resources of any type, we try and think about it in terms of like a micro funnel, kind of like what you're talking about, where that tertiary would be like top of funnel, secondary would be middle, and then, you know, constantly trying to make it really easy to slide into the product and usage, either through making it turnkey, clickable, or inspiring someone, or like, man, that sounds really cool, I want to try it, or something like that. I do want to kind of, I don't know, this might be a little contentious, but there is a question out there that just popped up that is kind of saying things in a way I hadn't thought about, but is a point I wanted to bring up. The person asking the question was talking about community of practice versus community of product. I know that before I got here, there was a very large, robust community that had evolved, and because it's an open source product, the community was very heavily skewed towards like a student demographic, which is not a problem, is a wonderful thing. But once we start talking about like, you know, as a business, as a company trying to actually make money so we can keep providing these open source tools, like otherwise we'll die. Like students don't have money, they don't have budget, they don't tend to spend. So we started trying to shift, and I think that I love that concept of community of practice versus community of product. And I think it goes back to that original question, Clayton, of the kind of organic versus more purposeful. We want to be inclusive for everyone. We want to invite everyone here, regardless of where they are in their own career or in their journey of understanding the product. But, you know, at the end of the day, if, you know, our job is to try and help create more usage of the product with developers who are going to find it useful, who are going to use it, you know, hopefully more and more in business applications so that we can stick around for a while and keep offering that. And so I think that that's where, kind of like Rebecca, you're talking about, where you have to be careful because developers are very allergic to marketing. So I want to always be careful not to be marketing. But then, you know, that idea of how do we find these people, how to reach out to them, how do we understand them, understand what they need and get them in, ultimately helping to drive the business objectives, right? Because that's why we're here in the first place, without necessarily kind of becoming just a shill for the company and actually thinking community. It's a very delicate balance, I think, and it's a tightrope that we walk. But I also think, just to sum it up, that people who enjoy DevRel and are good at it, I think are people who naturally enjoy the concepts and naturally enjoy talking about things and getting excited about new things and teaching and sharing and discovering. And so I think if that's kind of like the guiding star, then as much as possible, looking at things like, you know, what are the channels, what are the different levels, where are people at, and how do we try and make everyone welcome while still ensuring that, you know, the business outcomes are still something that we're tracking.
Totally. I like that each of you in your own way definitely expressed like those more organic or naturally occurring communities, using those as a form of research and understanding your customers. I feel like people get a little too caught up in SEO or search volume sometimes these days, and like understanding what people are needing when it comes to their brand or what's related to it. When like even in our own topic ideation, we're obviously diving into like, okay, how are they talking about you in your relevant subreddits, your Slack groups? Let's find out what the needs are. What are their customer service questions? What are they diving into? And taking that and applying it to, you know, your own formats when it comes to speaking to those individuals. We started getting into the weeds here. Let's maybe zoom out a little bit. Let's say, you know, you finally got the funding to make that DevRel hire. You finally got the cash to start investing in creating that community. What are those critical, like, first few steps that you would recommend us on when it comes to building out those communities?
I have like a million thoughts on this, but I don't want to
I'm
always go
sure.
first. So
I think Tessa, I think you and I have both gone to go first. Ron, you want to start, and then we can build on you.
yeah,
Unless you're like, no, heck no, I don't want to start, and then.
No, go ahead. I just got done talking a lot. I'll go in a minute.
I'll just say one is like, know your people, and whether or not your people size is 5 of your people that like really are trying to solve the pain point that your product solves, or it's 500. Know your people. And so whether or not you start small or medium, or for the very few out there who are like, wow, it's crazy, I started this thing and 5,000 people are already loving it. But usually it's going to be a smaller amount, and start small. Make sure you understand what they're trying to solve and what's useful and valuable to them. And then encourage them, or not even encourage them, invite them to then co-build what the rest looks like for the community with them. And so I wouldn't say like, don't put work on them being like, cool, thanks for being, like volunteer work, so here's like a bunch of stuff that you need to go do, but really understand what motivates them. Tessa, I think you talked a little bit about this before we even started the webinar, but understand what motivates them, what makes them feel acknowledged, what makes them feel rewarded, where their personal pain points are within their, it could be personal, but generally within their professional life, right? If you're working on a product that's helping them do their professional career role, and understand what it is that they're looking for that gives them value, and then enable them to then like either co-create content with you, or like make sure that you're encapsulating those themes, turning out content that really is useful for them that they would then want to share with their networks, and then enable them to invite other people who they know in their networks who are also looking to solve something similar to come to your community, and then keep adding on and like co-generating that value. And so know your people, whether or not you're starting small or like mid-size, and really understand what delivers value to them, and then enable them to help you grow that community because you're already delivering value, and then continue generating what that value means as the community grows over time. So that's my one, is like, know your people and then start there.
that is such a good one to start with too. I think mine will be like almost like taking even steps back from that. So especially when we're looking at like a DevRel program or a developer program in general, and building up that community in that way, right? Very similar sentiment. For me, it's all of that business connection, right? And so whether we're building just a community, and it's not just but a community, or whether we're building a full-fledged developer program, you have to understand a multitude of different things. And so, and this all comes back to, I recently shared a tweet and I asked, what are your biggest challenges in DevRel? And this is actually kind of a sneak peek into a blog post I'm writing that I like dropped a bomb on. So if you're in the webinar and you're curious about what I found from the challenges, I'm going to say it right now. I figured out that it all boiled down to, everyone had an array of different challenges, right? Prioritization of work, business understanding, tracking metrics, understanding which content is more important than other content. And as I thought about it, I was like, oh my gosh, this all comes back to business understanding. They don't understand what the business needs in order to prioritize their work. They don't understand what the business needs in order to report on their impact, because they don't know what the business wants. And so I just sort of had this like epiphany of like, oh my gosh, this is the root problem of DevRel programs. And fundamental community programs in general, right, is that you have to go in to those different stakeholders, into that executive board, into whoever it is that you're working with, and say, hey, what do you know about DevRel? What do you know about community? Okay, great. These things are great. Yep, absolutely. I've seen that before. Here's what I want to bring to our company, right? And work together to build those bridges, and to have that understanding of what does a community need, what does your developer program need, and then from there, get to know your stakeholders. And there's actually a really great blog post on the Common Room blog, and it's called First 30 Days in a New DevRel Role. And just take a peek at that, because it'll sort of give you the early steps to get to this business buy-in. But at the end of the day, you have to come in and make sure that they understand why you're doing it, because community isn't always, here you go, here's the black and white impact that we drove. Sometimes it's vibes. Sometimes it is really clear metrics, but you have to be really diligent about making sure that they get it, that you get it. And then in turn, your strategic vision for that community is driving impact to every single cross-functional stakeholder. because then they will start sending their users to your community, right? So sales team, they're talking to a developer. Hey, have you actually checked out our community forum? I don't know about you, but not a lot of sales reps are like, hey, go check out our community aspects, right? And so that's all things that we have to sort of instill back to the community or back to our business. And so when we can have those conversations, build those bridges, then you can start building the community and you're like, oh, we're all on the same page. And I know that sales needs this, marketing needs this, customer success needs this, recruiting needs this. Here's what my developers need. How do I find that happy medium? And that's what I'm going to build and flourish from in my community.
It's incredible. It's like you guys are like reading my mind. I've had a lot of conversations recently with like our head of revenue and growth, and he's been trying to help me kind of figure out, like, in some of our reporting, like, how do we track? What are the metrics? How do we track this stuff? And I keep coming back to the fact it's almost impossible and it's insanely difficult, because DevRel, when done properly, does serve every stage of the customer lifecycle. Like Tessa, to your point, like, I'm constantly talking to sales about, like, what are the sales assets you need? Like, when you're talking to somebody, especially a developer, what do they need to see? Do they need to see a tutorial? Do they need a template? On what topics? Like, what can I create that's going to give you ammunition to say, oh yeah, we got that covered? Whether it's customer success and onboarding, where are the big pain points that people hit when trying to set up or get launched with our program? We're talking about, like, once we have somebody on board and we're looking to help our champions inside, evangelize internally and spread it. What are the things that are going to help you get other people excited about using this and kind of grow the program? So I was having this conversation with Neil about this. He's that the person I was telling you about, and he was trying to help me boil the ocean. He's like, okay, just hold on a sec, Ron. Like, what's your ultimate goal? What are you really trying to get to? And so we kind of talked through it, and I realized, I was like, honestly, the thing I care most about is just developers using the product. Like, whether that's for fun and they never become a customer, whether that's because they're curious, whether that's because they're solving their own problems on free tier, whether they're going to introduce it internally as a business, whether they're enterprise and they're going to, like, adopt this in a big way. Like, I want all of those things, but ultimately I just want them to use it. But you can't just track usage of the product, because how do you tie me writing a blog post or a tutorial or making a video to someone, signing up? Like, it's really difficult. So I think the big thing that we come back to, and I think the challenge, I'm very lucky because I don't really have much of this challenge, but Tessa, I think your point about, like, DevRel across the board, the biggest challenge is, how do you show that value to the business organization to make sure that you can align with what they need and give them, what their goals and priorities are, but also you can kind of validate your existence. Because I've seen it happen where, teams get cut or people get cut because they just don't see it. And then the things that we can't really measure that are so impactful and important are suddenly gone. And now suddenly you're struggling in new ways. You don't know why, because you couldn't really measure it easily in the first place. It is a really difficult thing to do this well, because you can do anything, and you sometimes do. But how do you make sure that you're finding that balance between what's going to be good for the business, what's going to be good for the developer, and how do I make sure that we have that balance? Like, I don't know how useful that was, but it's I feel like I feel like other people.
Yeah, I would say I would love to dive into that tangent, actually, just because we see so much of this on the agency side of people, like, going, how do we communicate the ROI here effectively to our business leaders, making sure our team's still getting that funding? Because honestly, sometimes if you're doing it right, it's still really hard to show the numbers. And then weirdly, if you're doing it wrong, it's really easy to show the numbers. So if you're just chasing bot traffic and just doing some of that easy SEO stuff, but it's not really turning anything over, but you can still go to leadership and look at these thousands of views we're getting on something. But community development is so much different in how it's just really hard to tie the ROI to it sometimes. So I'd love to get your perspective, because we see pretty much everyone struggles with this in one way or another.
Yeah. I think too, Clayton, knows to add on this, because I hear this a lot too. Like, a lot of it comes down to the organization's willingness to think long-term versus short-term. And unfortunately, a lot of tech marketing is driven by short-term results, like you kind of insinuated, Clayton, that, like, let's next month we need more leads than the previous month, so we can, and this is look, I worked in VC funded companies for a long time. No knock on them. They're all great. Like, it's a great model. It works really well for the right people in the right times, but it can be really tough to do DevRel in that environment when you need a year to 2 years to build up a community and reputation built on trust and long-term relationships. And they're saying, we got to have results in 3 months so we can raise the next round of funding. It's like, it's a really tough thing to sort of straighten out. So actually, I don't have an answer for this so much as I know it's a problem. So I'd love to hear how you guys are facing it too, just to kind of like for my own edification.
I mean, one of our core goals at Common Room is to solve this for folks in terms of, and I, in no way am I saying that we do this perfectly. And what's so good about our community and our customers is that we continually get feedback about how to make this better. But I think there's like two ways to talk about how you broke this down, right? In the long term and the short term. And so right now, I think, especially in it feels so silly to say like the macroeconomic climate we're in, but like in the macroeconomic climate we're in, and the pressure on every team to deliver, not only to deliver in general, but to deliver super lean and super efficiently, and like to consolidate tools, like just the level of things that they're like, do more with less, and, you know, be a 10x dev advocate, and you're like, I'm one person. And, you know, like deliver the size of a marketing team, but you are one individual, right? And so there's a lot of pressure going on. But at Common Room, like the way that we see this, right, is I think to go all the way back to what Tessa was saying, like understand, like know your business and know your stakeholder goals. And so one thing that you can do, or the one way that we solve this, or I should say directionally solve this for folks, it depends on your independent, like a very, you know, idiosyncratic use cases, is like, okay, what is important to your stakeholders in terms of who is coming into the community? And so that's not, and who's interacting with your brand across your connected channels, whether or not that's your primary, secondary, or tertiary channels. And if that, it's not just leads coming in, because like leads are actually, I would say, and I think Common Room is like, leads are not that useful. Because if you're just like, if you are passing leads to your sales team and they are spraying and praying, and there's no context behind it, and there's no person level insights behind it, that developer, like you said, Ron, like developers aren't allergic to value. They're allergic to marketing without like any personal context about how it solves their pain, right? And so once you're able to work with your go-to-market teams, your sales teams, your marketing teams to really understand who your ideal customer persona is, who that person who would actually get the most value, like what is the size of the organization, right? Like what is their last round of funding? What is their title and role? Are they an economic buyer? Are they a contributor in your community already? Are they connected to other people within their account or organization that are economic buyers? Are they the head of engineering, or are they like a student at a university, right? And so in that short-term way, you can define what is a qualified lead based on what they're doing in the product and their product usage, based on how they're contributing in your community, what their title and role is, and their firmographic data based on their organization is at. And so once you work with those stakeholders and know what the business needs, you're like, hey, what if one of our goals as developer relations leaders and dev advocates is to increase this type of persona in our community, or to increase engagement from this type of persona, or to run a few programs that enable those personas to bring in more of those personas. And so you can measure like short-term, one way you can measure, let's say, short-term effectiveness is by understanding the growth of who is most important to those other teams, to say like it's not just that you wanted leads, like you wanted qualified leads with actual context about person level, like solutions that these people are looking for. And now we can tie that to how they've used the product. Now we can tie that to the different levels of features. Did they request to invite new people into your product? And like, that's a huge like expansion opportunity, right? Or did they get started with a feature that is actually only available on a 30-day free trial? And so what is the timeliness and relevance that you can then deliver to your other teams that are meant to like, you know, earn calls and close deals over time? And so from a short-term point of view, right, it's like, how do you use and leverage your community programs to make sure that the right people to the organization are also entering it? And then I think from that longer-term point of view, and a place where a lot of us as community leaders really excel, is that openness to wanting to like share expertise, right? And that term point of view, I think, Ron, to your example, right, where it's that student might not be a buyer for 2, 4, maybe never, but 2, 4, 6 years, right? But there's that long-term play where if they're in your owned personal community, that person will indeed very likely over time be someone who will be like, you know what, I'm in this community and I've gotten a lot of value from it. And now I'm in a place to make decisions or to influence decisions around this. And they're likely going to come to your product first before anyone else if they've already gotten value from that community. And so I think that long-term play, we're able at Common Room, we allow you to do this. Other tools do too. Do your research, pick the one that's right for you.
It's Common Room.
But to be able to say like, hey, we saw this person, this buyer, this economic buyer or this influencer in the space, this person showed up in our community before they showed up in our CRM, before they showed up as a lead to anyone else. And so then you can start to attribute what the community did both in the short term and the long term in terms of those buyers who aren't ready to buy today, but who are interested in your space and already have an affinity for your brand and product.
Yes, I have to jump in because I just have to go next, Ron. I'm so sorry, but I have to build off of what Rebecca just said. Common Room is the only tool. You can argue with me, but try them all out and then come back and then we'll have a good debate over it. But it is just so vast. And so I just want to paint a really quick picture because you shared a really good vision of personas and how they play in and like how to really think about all that. And I think I could reiterate with like actual things that align to that, right? And so I love Common Room, like love it. And I will continue to say that forever and ever. But why I love it so much is because in order for you to track your DevRel program to its full extensity, you have to have the data. And that is our fundamental problem in most cases, is that either we don't have access to the tools that have the data, or the tools that we do have, or they don't collect what we need, right? Or the data is just not being captured. Maybe we are someone who came into a DevRel role and we're a year or two in and we have no clue what attribution means and how to track that down and who to even work with and what that even looks like. And so as I think about tracking DevRel programs, I look at activity tracking as my key. And that is what Common Room is so good at. And so Rebecca spoke to why that's important, right? To be able to define those audiences, go after those certain really high impact leads that are going to deliver on the revenue side. But there's just so many aspects to it. So when you think about that developer journey map that I shared, right? They're coming in at that discover stage. What got them in there? Like, how do you know that? If you have all of those discover stage platforms inside of Common Room and they're all linked and integrated, you can get this beautiful picture of a user because it'll say, boom, they followed you on X or Twitter. They engaged in your community. They replied here. They shared a thing here, right? It's just this flow. And so when you have that flow, you can bring that into, say, a CRM at your company. All of a sudden, when sales happens to just pop upon a lead because they start to engage, they can actually see that attribution right in their CRM, right? And so it's like, oh, let's look back up. It says that Common Room told us that they actually posted in our community. We sent that back over to our CRM, and now we have this full picture. And before you know it, sales is like, ooh, DevRel lead, ooh, DevRel lead, ooh, DevRel lead. Because when we're working with developers, it's going to likely start with a developer relations team, but there hasn't always been a great way to attribute that back until Common Room. And until this concept of really thinking about this full holistical community. How do you bring all the channels in? How do you bring all the external communities in? How do you associate that with your internal community? And then what does that mean for all the stages that your developer is going in? Because when they move from discover to evaluate, for example, you want to also associate them into that next segment. And Common Room can also do that. So in your backend or in your CRM or wherever you're tracking, you can say, hey, it looks like they started to look at our FAQ page. They signed up for our newsletter, right? Now we can see their traffic flows into an FAQ page. They're in the evaluate stage, right? And we can set triggers that would change the stage that they're in. And so us as engagers, as sales, as DevRel, as whomever, can go in and say, wow, look at the path this person's been on. They're right at that decision stage. Well, what can we send them? What else can we push towards them to do that? And then after the fact, right? Boom, what are all these platforms that they went to? DevRel. Now they made a sales. And now all of a sudden your DevRel team can say, boom, here's the revenue that we impacted. And now sales has this attribution back to DevRel. They see you, they love you. Marketing's like, yes, you're bringing in the leads. Customer success is like, oh my gosh, look at, they're finding answers all over the place. And now they understand a full vision of what someone has gone through and can give them an answer that is like, oh, you've tried all these other things. Great. Let's send you here because this is what you haven't tried. I'm going to digress, but yeah, it's just a beautiful picture that can be created with the different tools and you actually tracking all these different engagements at all the different journeys.
So I'd like to kind of just say the same thing in a slightly different way, with a slightly different perspective. And I'm now having some better results with this framing internally. Not that I need it as much as some people might, but it could be useful. So back in the day, the way that we sold things was different. So I have enough gray in my beard that I've kind of seen some of that switch. And, you know, if you think about like kind of old school sales, there's like taking people out to lunch and meeting on the golf course and, you know, AEs with big budgets and company credit cards and all this other fun stuff. But what we've seen, especially as we moved into tech sales, which often has some type of trial or free version or open source, and especially with different generations. So especially when you look at like millennials who are now kind of like moving up to the top of the pile, and now Gen Z, they don't want to talk to you. And by the time they've raised their hand to say, hey, I got a question, they're already probably an expert in your product, right? And so that's that researcher journey. And so there was a recent conversation with my whole company. And one of the things that our CEO was saying was he was talking about this researcher journey. And he's like, what everyone here needs to realize is that by the time we've heard of somebody, there's 1,000 people who were potentially interested that never raised their hand, that we never talked to or that we never heard from. And I think that that's exactly what Tessa's talking about with like trying to be mindful of collecting data and where are people at. Number one, so that we can properly attribute that and improve the conversion. But number two, also so we can understand what do these people care about? Like, did they self-select out because they didn't find what they were looking for, or they heard someone else could solve a problem that we can also solve first, and they went that way? Like, why did they filter themselves out of the funnel? But also, when you back up and you take a look at the whole kind of customer journey, in that researcher journey piece at the beginning, from discovery all the way through to finally engaging with us, is a bit of a black box. And so it's another reason why I'm such a big believer in trying to creating our own community so that we have better ways to track the numbers. But I think that once we start to tie the importance of that, like how many people are we losing before they even hit a recognizable funnel, like before they even hit like an MQL of some type, even a fractional change in that number can be a massive impact on the organization. So I think as DevRel professionals, as we start to really recognize, yeah, we definitely support the entire customer journey, especially for a developer tool. The more that we show that in that researcher stage, because again, developers are allergic to marketing, we actually have an outsized impact in our ability to help get people across the finish line of at least getting the technical win. Yes, this tool can do the thing I want it to do. This will help me. Whether or not that turns into a business win is a whole other discussion, but that's something that we can do that honestly nobody else really can. And once we start to like educate people on this and that overcoming the black box of the researcher journey, and that's what we're maybe not primarily but largely here to do, I think it starts to make the value of DevRel a lot more compelling.
You hit the nail on the head. Sales today is so much, no matter how you look at sales marketing, it's so much about just being an information source these days. I was talking to a founder last week who had a very refreshing, clear understanding. He was looking for someone to reformat his documentation because he's like, if I know developers well, if they're not able to figure out how to use my product on their own within the first like 15 minutes logging into my website, if they can't find that quick guide, they're gone. They're out. Like I feel like although documentation sort of ancillary, it's very similar to the community functionality, big resource for everyone there.
100%.
Yeah, we're down to our last 11 minutes here. We have one question, so let's maybe dive into this. And then if we have a little extra time, I have a few more questions too that we can dive into. What's the difference between a community of practice and a community of product when building a new community for your company? Is one better than the other?
So we approach this a couple ways at Common Room. And not to, let's say, to be vocally self-critical, it's like a mixed bag on whether or not people are like, yeah, this is the way to do it. And some people are like, yeah, I would prefer like a stronger lean into one or the other. But we have, at least in our own Slack community, we have it's both a community of practice and a community of product. So first I'll define at least how we talk about that, or how we view it, so that we all are working from the same definition, and they might be nuancedly different, and we can talk about that. And then I'll talk about why we chose to make it a hybrid community of practice and product. And there are pros and cons to that, I think. And so a community of practice is really an industry practice or a solution based, like how are people, how are people handling their data, right? Which data warehouses are they using? What are the best like pipelines? How do they integrate these different products that solve different things around data? That might be a community of practice, right? In terms of like, what are we doing in this field, in this practice and field of, working with data? And then a community of product might be like, okay, what is a specific tool or product that solves this around this data piece, right? And so a community of product would be really focused on maybe that more specific product-based solution and how to use that product best to achieve the results you're looking for in that field, that practice of data. That's like the most basic generic. I don't know. I'm just saying data as though it's like data. But that would be practice, right? The practice of working with data, and the product being that solves this thing that you're trying to do with this tool around that pain point. Common Room, we actually have a hybrid community of practice and product, meaning when we first started over 3 years ago, we were specifically looking to solve that one question for developer relations and community leaders. How do you build better programs, manage better programs, measure your programs, and then show the impact of your community work? And so we originally wanted to make Common Room, or our Uncommon community, Common Room's community, which is called Uncommon in Slack, a space for people to just talk about the practice of community leadership and DevRel programming. And so first we started with that, just a space for people to talk about ideas, strategy, questions, advice, because we knew that tooling around this didn't exist well. And so we just wanted people in the field to be able to gather and talk about these things, not only to learn from each other, but also as a space for us to learn as a product that wanted to solve that. What are the biggest pain points for these people who are looking for products that solve these things? What are the biggest pain points for people in this field? So we started out and opened it specifically as a community of practice, the practice of community building, the practice of community support, the practice of community co-generation. And then as we continued to build our product itself, we added individual channels and make them very specific, where it's like Common Room product help, Common Room wish list, Common Room feedback. And so that way, people who were in the community and decided to join our community simply for that practice-based discussion, they didn't have to be in the product-based discussions. But for us as a company and as a product, at least they were invited to those channels should they wish to be. And as they got closer to, let's say they weren't at a role that would necessarily need Common Room as a product, but then they moved roles over time. Now they're in a space where they're like, oh, I actually might have a use for this, and I want to start the free trial, or even the free forever plan is good enough for me, but now I have some questions around it. Then we see them moving from that community of practice into the community of product to learn, or into the channels rather of product to learn a little, to ask their question, get a response within 24 hours. Sometimes it's our support team. A lot of times it's other community members who are like, oh, I just solved this myself. So that's kind of how we see both what community of product and practice is, and then how we ourselves have decided to approach that within our own community. And honestly, we get generally, most people are like, oh, I like how this combines both. But there are pros and cons, because that also means that when people land in your community, they might have had an expectations about one thing and actually been dropped into I'm in this community channel, and it's harder for them to navigate because they're like, oh, where do I ask product-based questions? And there's onboarding refinements that we can do, and education refinements and expectation refinements that we can do. But I think at the highest level overall, people have generally been like, oh, this is kind of neat that it's a space for both. And as a company from from the internal view looking out, it's also helpful for us because if sometimes people come for the product and stay for the community, sometimes people come for the community and then learn about the product.
I think this comes back to like your strategic vision again, right? Like, what is it that you're trying to accomplish as a business? And I think that a lot of that's going to come back down to market research too. So like to exactly what Rebecca was saying, right? Like DevRel professionals don't have a lot of places to go to talk to our peers, to get resources, to just kind of engage with one another. It's really just honestly a few kind of SOC communities and things here and there. And so to do that, I think made tons of sense for that audience. But if you look at, say, like the DevOps community, let's say you're like a new product coming into the DevOps community. Well, there's like already so many different communities there, right? Like it probably doesn't make sense for you to come in and be like, this is the practice of DevOps, because that's somewhat has been done and have some offerings there. But at the same time, maybe you're in this niche place where it makes sense. And so I think where that comes down to is really your strategic vision for like the purpose of your community. Like, is it truly to serve just your company and your product, or does your company serve more than just its product? And that's where I think it comes down to, like thinking about open source, right? If you're in an open source company, absolutely. Like that should be a completely different way of thinking about it. Practice should be a part of, sort of this like product, but it's not always necessarily a product, right? It's hopefully a lot more like practice on that open source project. And then your product is sort of just kind of like Rebecca says, like a tertiary, right? It's just kind of like an additive. And so I really think that it completely comes down to like what you're trying to accomplish. I'm working on a really fun new project. Like I just get to drop like these little cute bombs in this webinar, and I can't wait to like go tell people who have been asking me what I'm doing, go watch the webinar so you can learn. I'm actually rolling out a new offering, and it is going to be a very similar sentiment. And I went through that strategic process of like, hey, how do I go about thinking about this? Do I only offer this community to the people who want to come into my program? Or do I offer this community to the practice of DevRel? And at the end of the day, the reason that I'm pulling together built for .dev, the idea of the concept and framework around building developer programs with great business impact, is actually needs both, right? And so just like what Common Room has done, I want to change the practice. I want folks to have resources and frameworks and worksheets and things that they can pick up and say, oh my gosh, yes, I can build a super fans program because I had this framework that I got from built for .dev. And now I understand the tooling because I saw a course or an article here that breaks that down. And so in that way, right, I want to fundamentally change the industry. And so it's important for me to be really tuned into the practice, but yet I still have a program that I'm going to offer. It's still going to be a product. And so I need that piece of it because that's where folks are going to actually gain access to some of those resources and things that they're actually opting into. And so again, it's all about the strategy. Like, what are you trying to do and how do you need to get that done with the right audience and the right practice?
Yeah, I think the it depends is the only right answer.
Yep.
When I got here, the company was already a few years old and already was on its way to 40-something thousand stars on GitHub and like thousands of users on Discord. And we're trying to shift from being purely open source into an actual like money-making company because that's what the VCs expect, right? And so it started as more of that community of product. And the space that we play in is building internal tools and a platform for developers, like developer first. But what we found out as we started looking at things is, again, I go back to that micro funnel idea where we want to try and appeal to everyone who might be interested, right? All developers who kind of fit within the possible thing and help them get down. So for me, I think of it from like the community of practice is like more of that top of funnel. And that is great for building awareness. That's great for providing value that, you can just learn something about the top tips for this, or how do you use this industry standard thing, or what's a strategy for thinking about the way you package your code, whatever it may be. And then the community of product is that bottom of funnel, like actually logging in, actually using the product, actually building and deploying things, and hopefully inviting people and all those other things. So I think you will, on that spectrum, you will need to have both to some degree. I think there are definitely some cases where you might be 99% one and 1% the other, or, the other way. But I think figuring out where on that scale is right for you is something that you have to figure out. And I also think that shifts over time, depending on how your community is growing, depending on what's going on in the world, depending on your goals as a company. So from that perspective, I agree. It depends is the answer. But I think, again, if you have like the concepts of those things, you have the tools like Common Room. I'm super interested now in what Tessa's working on, but having that knowledge and framework about how to think about those things is really the key.
Never the fun answer, but usually the right answer in our world. It depends. Thank you guys so much for joining today. Be respectful of everyone's time here. We did just hit the top of the hour. Join us for our next one in March. We could probably do a part 2 later this year on developing communities. We didn't even get into maintaining, scaling, driving diversity, inclusion. So maybe we'll be doing a second.
I wrote too many questions.
Yeah,
you guys had too much to say.
Yeah. But thank you again, everyone, for joining. We'll be following up with the recording and more information in the coming days.
Thank you so much for having us. Such a treat to be on this Zoom with you.
Thank you guys so much. This was fun. Appreciate it.
Ditto.
Yeah, so fun listening. Thanks.
Yeah.